I knew something was off when my tulips kept getting trampled every Saturday morning like clockwork. At first, I thought it was raccoons or maybe the neighbor's kids sneaking around, but after the third weekend and a broken sprinkler head, I started to get suspicious. My name's Vaughn Mercer. I work from home, I mind my business, and I keep my yard tidy apparently, too tidy for Deborah Niles, our HOA Vice President and full-time tyrant. She's the kind of woman who power walks around the block at 6 a.m. with a clipboard in hand and a permanent scowl on her face. Middle-aged blonde Bob always wears a pastel sweater set no matter the weather. You know the type. Deborah had it out for me ever since I painted my shutters forest green instead of approved moss sage. She fined me, of course, and I appealed it successfully. That didn't sit well with her. One Friday night, I was sitting on my back porch sipping a beer when I thought I saw a figure near the back fence. But when I stepped down to check, the yard was empty. The next morning, more broken flowers. That's when I knew it wasn't wildlife, so I installed cameras. Not the cheap ones either. I bought a solid set of infrared, motion-triggered cams and angled them just right to cover every inch of my yard. I didn't tell anyone, not even my neighbor Curtis, who's usually in the loop on all the HOA drama. 3 nights later, I got my answer. It was just after midnight. My phone pinged with a motion alert. I opened the live feed, and there she was, Deborah Niles herself, creeping through my yard in orthopedic sneakers and a hoodie that said, HOA Strong. She crouched beside my flower bed, pulled something from her pocket and sprinkled it around. Then she yanked out 2 sprinkler heads and walked off like it was her garden. I just stared at the screen, stunned. Honestly, I expected a teenager or some bored kid. Not a grown woman with a leadership role in the HOA, but there she was, caught red-handed. The next morning, I didn't say a word. I went about my business, waved at her during her morning patrol like nothing had happened. She gave me that tight-lipped smile she always used when she thought she had the upper hand. I spent the rest of that weekend pulling footage and backing it all up. Different nights, different angles. Turns out she'd been sneaking into my yard at least 5 times over the past month. Sometimes she was dropping something near the edges of my lawn weed killer, maybe. Other times she was just kicking over the solar lights. It was deliberate. Every single time. I didn't go to the HOA board, not yet. I had a better plan. It was Monday morning when I made my first move. I printed out 4 still images from the clearest video. One with her crouched beside the sprinkler valve, another mid-sabotage, one where her face was unmistakable under the porch light glow, and the last of her walking along the fence line holding what I later identified as a bottle of glyphosate concentrate. I tucked them into a manila envelope and drove straight to city code enforcement. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up until I slid the envelope across the counter. I've got evidence of repeated trespassing, property damage, and potential chemical dumping, I said. And it's coming from a member of my HOA board. That got her attention. An hour later, I was in a back office with a municipal inspector named Alonzo Rivas. He was wiry, sharp-eyed, and meticulous. I handed him a flash drive with the full video archive. "Do you know what she poured near your fence?" he asked, clicking through the footage. "Not yet," I said. "But I've got samples. I dug out some of the contaminated soil and bagged it. It's in my car." He nodded slowly. "We'll fast-track it." "You did the right thing collecting it before rainfall could spread it." He took everything, the soil samples, the drive, and my written statement. Then, as I was leaving, he said something that stopped me in my tracks. "She's not just on the HOA board. She's listed as the primary contact for their municipal landscaping grant. That means if she's misusing chemicals, it could violate the city's urban stewardship agreement." I hadn't known that. But suddenly, it all clicked. She wasn't just a control freak. She was managing funds and contracts tied to environmental compliance. If she'd been using unapproved herbicides or tampering with irrigation to create inflated repair costs, that wasn't just petty. That was fraud. I went home and called my neighbor Curtis. "You remember that dead patch along your hedge?" I asked. "Yeah, thought it was just poor soil." "Dig it up," I told him. "Check for residue." "I think you've been hit too." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You think she's been doing this to more than just you?" "I'm almost positive. By Thursday, I had confirmation." The city lab results came back. The soil was laced with glyphosate levels over 7 times higher than what's permissible in residential areas. They'd also found traces of an industrial surfactant not available to the public, the kind used by commercial applicators. I didn't wait. I called a friend of mine from college, Alina, now a paralegal for a prominent environmental law firm. She reviewed the footage, the lab results, and the grant paperwork I'd pulled from the city's open records portal. "This is textbook misappropriation," she said. "If she's accessing municipal grants and then deliberately damaging private property to file inflated repair claims or justify vendor kickbacks, she's in serious violation." We filed a formal complaint with the city's Office of Inspector General by Friday, but I wasn't done. That weekend, I went door to door with a printed flyer. "Have you had mysterious yard damage? You're not alone." I didn't name her. I didn't have to. People knew exactly who I meant. A retired Navy corpsman down the street showed me his warped garden box. A single mother named Jada on the next block said her irrigation timer had been ripped out 3 times. And an elderly couple 2 houses over revealed that their entire flower bed had been salted, literally salted, with bags of sodium chloride they'd found dumped under the mulch. I gathered 13 signed statements. Curtis helped me create a neighborhood incident map with timestamps and damage descriptions. We printed it poster size and brought it to the next HOA meeting. I showed up early. The meeting was in the community rec center, where rows of folding chairs faced a plastic table draped in a blue cloth. Deborah was already there, sipping from a steel tumbler and flipping through the agenda like she hadn't committed a single felony in her life. When the meeting opened, I waited for the public comment section. Then I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and unrolled the poster with a snap. "This," I said, "is a map of every property in our neighborhood that's reported unexplained damage to gardens, sprinklers, and landscaping features over the past 3 months. 13 homes, all within a 3-block radius, all targeted at night." Deborah narrowed her eyes. "Mr. Mercer, this isn't on the agenda, I'm aware. But under Section 9 of our bylaws, public comments can raise matters of neighborhood concern." I held up a USB drive. "This contains video evidence of you entering my property 5 times without permission, damaging sprinkler heads. Pouring illegal chemicals, the same chemicals later found by the city in my soil. I've submitted it to both code enforcement and the Inspector General." The room fell silent. Deborah's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Then I turned to the rest of the board. "And if any of you were aware of this, or benefited from vendor kickbacks tied to falsified repair reports, you might want to speak to a lawyer before your names end up on the complaint." One of the junior board members, a guy named Ron who ran a hardware store, stood up and walked out without saying a word. Another woman leaned over and whispered something to the treasurer, whose face went pale. The room was unraveling. Deborah finally spoke. "This is slander. You can't just accuse people without—" "Deborah," came a voice from the back. It was Officer Linden from the local precinct. I'd filed a trespassing report earlier that morning, and he'd offered to attend the meeting as a courtesy. "You've already been named in an open investigation," he said. "I suggest you don't say anything else until your attorney's present." Her face drained of color. She sat down, trembling slightly. The tumbler in her hand hit the table with a faint metallic tap. By the following week, the city froze the HOA's access to the landscaping grant. The Inspector General's office launched a formal audit. Deborah was removed from the board in an emergency vote after 4 members resigned. An interim president, an accountant named Marla, was appointed while the investigation played out. The best part: A clause in the HOA bylaws allowed for a recall vote if 30% of homeowners signed a petition citing malfeasance or gross misconduct. With everything I'd gathered, we hit that number in 6 days. They called a special election. Curtis ran for president. I ran for secretary. We both won. And Deborah? She lawyered up. I heard through the grapevine she's facing 3 separate charges: trespassing, environmental code violations, and grant fraud. Funny thing is, my tulips bloomed just fine this spring. The first official meeting of the newly restructured HOA board wasn't what anyone expected. Half the chairs were empty, and the remaining members sat stiffly, unsure of what they were supposed to be doing without Deborah barking orders from the head of the table. Curtis looked uncomfortable in the president's seat, but he wore it well-clean collared shirt, printed agenda, and a calm tone that made even the most skeptical residents sit up and listen. I had my hands full as secretary. After the audit froze the association's spending, we couldn't pay vendors, couldn't authorize repairs, and couldn't process any new complaints. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came from the city clerk's office in the form of a thick manila envelope stamped with a red sticker that read, "Request for Municipal Review." Inside was a copy of the HOA's landscaping grant agreement and stapled to the back, a forged signature. It wasn't mine, but it was supposed to be. "Deborah submitted this?" I asked, pulling the paper closer. The handwriting was a crude attempt at my name, but the loops were exaggerated and she'd used the wrong middle initial. "She submitted it last March," said Marla, the interim president before Curtis had been voted in. Apparently, that's how she got the second disbursement approved. "Your name was listed as co-signer for the maintenance schedule certification." "She forged my name on a city financial document," I said quietly. "That's not just fraud, that's a felony." Marla nodded. Already turned it over to the district attorney's office. So now we were dealing with more than just chemical damage or trespassing. Deborah had used falsified signatures to collect over $25,000 in city funds. Money that was supposed to go toward native plant restoration and stormwater management improvements. Instead, it had gone into the pockets of a contractor named Blaine Huxley, a man who, as it turned out, was both unlicensed and Deborah's nephew. Curtis and I spent the next 2 days combing through invoices. Blaine's company, Greenscape Innovations, had billed the HOA for soil testing, French drain installation, and invasive species removal. Not one of those services was ever performed. We even called in a licensed arborist to confirm that the so-called invasive removal had been nothing more than a few trimmed hedges and a bag of mulch dumped behind the rec center. It got worse. One of the invoices was for a tree removal on Pine Ridge Lane, a house that had been vacant for over a year. No one had authorized it, and the city had no record of a permit. When we checked the address, the tree was still there, alive and well. We boxed up everything, copies of the invoices, the fake signatures, and the full vendor list, and delivered it straight to the district attorney's office. The investigator assigned to the case, a sharp-eyed woman named Kendra Vale, didn't seem surprised. "I've been building a case on this contractor for months," she said, flipping through the paperwork. "But I didn't know he had an inside connection on a neighborhood board. This explains the sudden spike in payouts." Kendra took everything, including the additional footage we hadn't publicized. One clip showed Deborah meeting Blaine behind the rec center after dark, handing him an envelope and gesturing toward the HOA's tool shed. Another showed him loading 3 heavy boxes into the back of his van, boxes labeled City Issued, Rainwater Diversion Kit. Those kits were part of a pilot program. They were supposed to go to residents selected by the city for sustainable water use upgrades. We found out later that Deborah had intercepted the shipments and handed them off to Blaine, who sold them online. Back in the neighborhood, word spread fast. Residents who had once tiptoed around Deborah were now calling city hotlines and leaving statements with the DA's office. A former board member, Teresa Geller, came forward with an email thread Deborah had forwarded by accident in which she instructed another board member to misplace a permit application from a resident who had complained too often. Then, 3 days after the investigators' visit, the police showed up. It wasn't subtle. 2 squad cars pulled into Deborah's driveway right after sunrise. Officers knocked, waited, and when she didn't answer, produced a warrant and went in. She was escorted out in handcuffs, wearing a bathrobe and house slippers, shouting about neighborhood loyalty and how ungrateful everyone was. She was charged with 5 counts initially: forgery, misappropriation of city funds, criminal trespass, tampering with physical evidence, and conspiracy to defraud a municipal program. Blaine was picked up later that afternoon at a gas station 2 towns over. He had a trunk full of unopened rain barrel kits and a burner phone with dozens of texts between him and Deborah. Some were just logistics. Others were full of complaints about idiot neighbors and how she'd make them pay one way or another. The trial took months to unfold, but in the meantime, we got to work cleaning up the mess. The city agreed to temporarily manage the grant until we could elect an oversight committee. Curtis appointed a retired civil engineer named Lyle to head that. Lyle didn't say much, but he reviewed every single vendor agreement with the focus of a man disarming a bomb. We also held a public meeting where residents could propose community improvement ideas. Instead of fear or tension, there was laughter. Ideas ranged from a community garden to installing motion-activated path lights along the walking trails. Then came the ethics review. Turns out, the HOA's bylaws hadn't been updated in over 15 years. They lacked any language about financial oversight, emergency voting procedures, or protection against conflicts of interest. So I took point on the rewrite. We added a 3-tier transparency clause requiring all board communications involving money to be archived and available upon request. We created a rotating audit committee so no 2 consecutive terms could control the books. And we implemented a recall mechanism that didn't require a supermajority, just verification of rule violations, and a petition from 20% of residents. None of these changes would have been possible without the chaos Deborah had caused. Ironically, her downfall gave us a chance to rebuild the HOA into something the community actually trusted. By the time her trial began, the neighborhood was back on its feet. I attended the first day, sitting in the back row of the courtroom while attorneys laid out her web of lies. The prosecution presented video, emails, forged documents, and even Blaine's testimony. He'd cut a deal in exchange for full cooperation. Deborah tried to claim he acted alone. But the evidence was overwhelming. When they played the clip of her pouring chemicals on my flower bed, the whole room went silent. The jury didn't take long. She was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 3 years, with restitution payments ordered for the city and all affected residents. We used our share to repair the damage to gardens and irrigation systems, and installed a new community library box in front of the rec center. Someone even donated a bench in her honor painted bright sage green with a plaque that read, "Here lies the reign of HOA tyranny. No one asked who paid for it. Life went on." The tulips came back stronger the next spring, and the neighborhood, once divided by fear and fines, felt more like a place where people actually wanted to live. Curtis still jokes that we should frame the footage and hang it in the rec center. I haven't said no. 3 months passed after the trial, and the neighborhood had settled into something that almost resembled harmony. With Deborah behind bars and our new board running smoothly, most residents assumed the worst had already been unearthed. But then, during a routine cleanup of the HOA's storage room, Lyle found something odd tucked behind a rusted filing cabinet, an accordion folder labeled "Pending Claims" in faded marker. Curtis called me over that afternoon. The folder was stuffed with handwritten notes, half-completed reimbursement forms, and a stack of old receipts. Some were stained, others barely legible. But what caught my eye was a ledger with columns titled Private Adjustments Non-Reported. She had a second set of books, I said, flipping through the pages. And she wasn't just skimming from city grants. Look at these names. Curtis squinted. These aren't vendors. No, I said, tapping the margins. They're residents. Dozens of entries listed amounts paid for things like compliance mediation, unscheduled yard correction, and unauthorized appearance deviation. The numbers varied, but all had one thing in common: none of these fees had ever been approved by the board, nor had they been recorded in the official financials. She was collecting cash from homeowners off the books, I said, and calling it enforcement. Curtis turned pale. How many people? Looks like over 30, and these dates go back almost 4 years. We brought the folder to Kendra at the district attorney's office. She scanned the documents, then leaned back in her chair with a look that made my stomach turn. This is extortion, she said. And if she threatened residents into paying these fees under false pretenses, we're looking at a whole new set of criminal charges. The next week, subpoenas were issued to previous board members. One of them, a man named Gary Linwood, confessed to personally collecting cash from residents on Deborah's behalf in exchange for leniency on code violations, most of which had been fabricated. He agreed to testify under oath in exchange for immunity. But the real revelation came when investigators examined the account number Deborah had handwritten on several of the forms. It wasn't tied to any HOA bank. It was a private account opened under the name of a shell nonprofit, Community Appearance and Safety Trust. Curtis and I sat in stunned silence as Kendra explained. She created a fake nonprofit and funneled money through it. The account's connected to a safety deposit box in her name. We're getting a warrant to open it. Inside the box, they found over $18,000 in cash, nearly 100 prepaid cards, and a spiral notebook with entries detailing resistance cases, a phrase she used to describe residents who had challenged her authority. Each entry included addresses, dates, and notes like needs pressure, repeat warning, and even target lawn lighting system non-compliant. We thought we'd seen the worst of her manipulation. We were wrong. One of the names in her notebook belonged to an elderly woman named Edna who had passed away the previous year. Her granddaughter, Kara, still lived in the home. When we approached her with what we'd found, she invited us in and pulled out a locked tin from the back of a closet. My grandma made me promise not to open this unless something happened to her, Kara said, handing it over. Inside were letters written in Edna's neat script detailing months of harassment. Deborah had cornered her multiple times, warning her that a non-compliant yard would result in liens, forced sale, or worse. One letter even described a night when Deborah parked down the street and shined a flashlight into Edna's windows for nearly 30 minutes. She was terrified, Kara said. But too proud to admit it. She paid every fee just to be left alone. The district attorney's office added criminal intimidation to the charges and reopened the civil suit to include restitution to all defrauded residents. A list was compiled, and Curtis Hand delivered the news to each home. Some cried. Others just nodded, eyes glassy, as if they'd finally been vindicated after years of quiet humiliation. Then came the final audit. A forensic accountant hired by the city discovered that Deborah had also been manipulating HOA insurance claims. For 5 separate years, she'd submitted inflated damage reports after storms claiming extensive erosion, broken signage, and structural issues that never existed. The payout totals exceeded $70,000. The money was never used for repairs. Instead, it had been funneled into private contractors who never performed the work. 2 of them turned out to be registered to the same address, a duplex owned by Deborah's sister in a neighboring county. The paper trail was enough to trigger a federal investigation for wire fraud and insurance fraud. With everything unraveling at once, the court moved quickly. Deborah was brought back to face a second trial, this time in a higher court. The charges included fraud, witness intimidation, extortion, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Her expression during the arraignment was vacant, as though she still couldn't comprehend that the empire she built out of pettiness and control had utterly collapsed. Her attorney tried to argue diminished capacity. The judge wasn't buying it. Curtis and I testified during sentencing. I spoke about the night she stepped into my yard and thought no one would notice. About what it felt like to live under the thumb of someone who believed rules existed only to protect her power, and about the strength of a community that finally stood up and said, "Enough." The judge sentenced her to 12 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 8. Restitution was ordered to each resident she'd extorted, with the balance owed to the city and its insurance fund. The courtroom was packed that day. No one cheered. No one needed to. The silence that followed her sentencing was louder than any applause. An invisible weight finally lifted from our neighborhood. Afterward, we held a cookout on the rec center lawn. Curtis grilled ribs, Kara brought peach cobbler, and Lyle unveiled a new tool-lending shed built entirely by volunteers. Someone passed around a clipboard suggesting we rename the neighborhood garden. By unanimous vote, it became Tulip Watch, a quiet joke and a lasting reminder. We replaced the old metal sign at the front of the development with one carved from reclaimed wood. It read, "Welcome to Fairview Glen, a community, not a kingdom." We never needed another security camera after that, but I kept mine running just in case. Not out of fear, but because vigilance doesn't end when the villain is gone. It ends when the community knows how to protect itself, and now we do.